Hello and welcome to the Industry and Esports Insider podcast, where I speak to people and personalities within the esports sector. I'm your host, Tom Daniels, and today I'm joined by Harris Peskin, a partner at ESG Law. Now, they are an esports law firm that represents a whole host of organizations, such as NRG, G2, Team Liquid, Misfits, and many, many more. So we're going to be talking about whether esports and the esports ecosystem has a sustainability problem, with a particular focus on League of Legends. We also discuss player unionization, how esports teams are navigating the current climate within esports, and also the power game developers have. But before we jump into this podcast, this episode is brought to you by Ross Video's Esports Solutions. Connect with your gaming community on a deeper level with powerful and easy to use broadcast technology tools. To learn more, then visit rossvideo.com/esports. So, let's get into the episode. First, before we start everything though, I do just want to say, Harris, how are you?
I'm great. Sitting here, my dog in the background, as I'm sure you could see. Doing good. Just, super busy right now. Working through a lot of stuff on the team side as always, but also got my other, projects I'm kind of working on just to do some fun stuff other than law from time to time. It's been a bit of a wild ride here. Esports, video games, I should say, is such an interesting industry because, everyone is always grinding as hard as they can, and you need to just make sure you're keeping up.
Yeah, it's the never stop mentality, isn't it? Really, that's just what esports is and gaming is in general. I think the first thing I want to do actually before we jump into the topic which I discussed in the intro is kind of chatting about you in general, about Harris the person, and then about ESG Law as a whole. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and then also about ESG Law, because you are a dedicated esports law firm, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to. Just to start off about myself a little bit, I got into video games at a really young age when I was 3 years old. My mom was giving birth to my sister, her daughter, and she basically just wanted something to keep me entertained, so she threw me an old school Nintendo, even before the Super Nintendo, and I was playing a game called Blades of Steel on that, and so that's my first memory, to be honest with you. So I've been playing video games since I was 2 or 3 years old. It's crazy, but I was really into fighting games as a kid, like Mortal Kombat and Street Fighter. That was kind of my thing, and then when I was I moved in high school, and I went to a new high school, or I guess in middle school into a high school, and really didn't know too many people, and so I started playing a fun game called World of Warcraft back in 2004, and kind of just that my high school was pretty big, but I didn't really tell anyone that I was playing it, so I kind of slowly and under the shadows, like a rogue, kind of came to be known as the kid that played World of Warcraft, and it was not a socially acceptable thing back in the day. And so, people would come up to me and they'd be like, "Hey, I hear you're playing World of Warcraft." I'd be like, "Yeah, but don't tell anyone." and then I ended up forming a guild and a club with a lot of those people that I was playing with, and that group of people that I was playing with is actually still to this day they're my best friends. They live 2 minutes away from me. We live in New York City. I have a commission. You can see it right there. I have a commission photo of all of us outside of Castle Nathria, which is one of the more recent raids, and we're all sitting in a hot tub because our guild's name is Hot Tub Wow Machine. It's a fun thing. So my passion, my gaming comes from World of Warcraft. 2004. We've never really stopped playing. I still play to this day. I'm a hardcore raider. It's kind of been, it's the game that kind of gave me everything, right? It gave me my friends. It gave me my career. And I thank it for that every single day. In terms of my professional career, one of the guys I played World of Warcraft with I got to be pretty close with him. That got me kind of introed into a law firm when I was at a law school. And I started writing a ton about, video games and esports in particular. End of the day, basically one of the investors, or one of the partners at the law firm, was super interested in kind of what I was writing, right? And saw that it was kind of a new topic, I guess I would say. And he was just like, you know what, why don't I consider investing in this? And it seems hot at the time. This is 2015, right? And so everyone loved esports. And so, I guess, he kind of just said, what can I invest in? And so I got in contact with some potential opportunities for him to invest in. I was at the law firm still, and he's a partner at the law firm. And I put together an investment for him and a couple of his buddies. We ended up buying H2K Gaming, which was at the time one of the bigger esports teams in Europe. It was, I think, at that point it was going to Worlds in the League of Legends World Championships in 2015, and so this is many years ago at this point. But that's what I did. So I was working at a law firm while also kind of helping run that investment, and at the end of the day, I ended up running the team or helping to run the team. It was a team effort, I would say, and some time comes along in 2016, and I moved to Germany to go run that team. And start running H2K with the group and leave the law firm. And so I kind of kissed goodbye the corporate law life and said, okay, like time to move and do video games full time. And that was a pretty big step for me. And ended up getting to meet a lot of owners over in Europe. Got to interact with Riot a lot. At the time, there was a huge question about relegation. There was a huge question about revenue share rights. And this is all 2016, right? So I got to play a pretty big role in having those conversations, which was nice. And really, I was one of the, I was an attorney at the time, right? I was just coming out of corporate law gigs. So it put me in a unique position. And 2016 comes and goes. At the end of 2016, H2K goes to the World Championships. We finished third. We lost to Samsung Galaxy at Madison Square Garden. I'm not sure if you remember that. That was the roster with Forgiven, Vander, Ryu, Orwamne, Yankos, right? Anyway, I realized at that point that I didn't really want to be an operator of a team. I would much rather use the law degree I had spent a lot of money going to law school to buy and learn and train for. And so I went back into the legal life and started doing my own thing. I repped a whole bunch of teams and players at certain points, and met up with my current partner. His name is Bryce Blum, who's doing a similar thing in North America. And together we formed ESG. He formed it first, and I kind of came on along after that, shortly thereafter. And now we represent, pretty much every single team in the ecosystem, whether it's TSM, Team Liquid, Cloud9, 100 Thieves, whatever. They're doing a deal where there's a high probability that we're looking at that deal. So if there's a sponsorship deal coming along, we'd probably have eyes on it. If there's a player contract that needs to be signed between the team and the player, we've probably drafted that. That's probably on our contract form. So it puts us in a very unique position where we kind of have a very good sense, I think, of the dynamics of the industry. It's not just from a team to player side or a team to business side. It's also from a team to developer side, because, if Riot Games comes along and says, hey guys, like, we would like you to join our franchise league in 2017. There are governing documents that needs to be drafted by that league, right? Like, we need to determine the governance structure, the revenue share structure, the rights that the teams are going to have collectively. And because we're representing all the teams, that puts us in a unique position to be able to negotiate against Riot, really, for better rights for the teams and a better economic framework for the league. And so that, to be honest with you, that last one has kind of probably been the thing that has, for me at least, been one of the more rewarding things, because it's one thing to just negotiate a whole bunch of sponsorships and a whole bunch of team deals with players, but like being able to stand up an entire ecosystem, and although people would probably say these days it's not so great, but it could have been a lot worse, put it like that.
I think it's really fascinating as well, because actually then, from what you're telling me with ESG Law, is that you've actually kind of represented these teams through essentially multiple different ecosystems. You've had the pre-franchise model, where it was kind of like all gung-ho essentially, relegation, promotion, fears and everything like that, and now it's more of a structured, partner franchise, and now it's even a partner team model. You see, it's like ESG has actually kind of gone through these different ecosystems alongside these teams. I guess they want to start with kind of the main question is that there is like this a lot of talk about like the bubble bursting within esports, and how healthy do you actually think the esports industry is right now? I mean, obviously it's not going to be like the pandemic levels, because interest was a lot higher and there were a lot of different kind of aspects that were at play. I mean, when sport wasn't available on TV, people had to consume something, and esports was genuinely the answer. But how actually healthy is the esports ecosystem right now, do you think, especially from a team perspective?
Yeah, and I think the team perspective is kind of the perspective that you want to analyze it from, because, the players are employed by the teams, right? So if we're talking about esports, then the success of the players is going to be contingent upon the success of the teams. We don't really, not to say we don't care about the game developer, but to be honest with you, these are multi-billion-dollar corporations. Like, my sympathy is lower. Sorry guys, if you're listening. But no, there's some good people over at these game developers, and actually over the years I've gotten to be kind of close to them just over the negotiating table, and they've really done a lot of good things to put us in a much better spot than we were initially. So I should be fair. But you asked a question about the bubble bursting, right? So I think that it's been, if you follow me on Twitter at least, I've kind of been of the mindset for quite some time that the problem in esports was that there was non-diversified revenue streams and excessive expenditures. And if I had to quantify where we are right now, if I had to tell you, like, has that changed? I would say that there are still excessive expenditures, less so, but still excessive expenditures. And I would also say that we really haven't diversified the revenue stream too much. So if the question is, what is the state of the bubble or the state of the ecosystem in esports, I would say that, like, we still have the same problem and we haven't taken structural steps to solve the problem. Now, with that said, I will caveat that by saying there are certain teams that have recognized that they cannot just be an esports team. They have to be something else. And they look then at then the question isn't, what is the state of the esports ecosystem? The question is, what is the desirability of owning an esports team? Because that's a different question, right? Like, the esports ecosystem from a self-sufficiency perspective is not there. The revenue streams just don't make sense. But you might choose to own an esports team because it's a good marketing venture, and you might want to market some other product that you have. Like, let's say, for example, I'm TSM or I'm someone else, like, not necessarily TSM, like, I have a brand, right? And like Razer, right? Like, Razer is it's obviously a big company. They make a whole bunch of stuff for keyboards, mice, right? Whatever it is, right? Like, they say the best way for me to market this is not to just affiliate myself with these teams. What if I just owned a team? Like, and really at that point, like, they're doing the marketing themselves. They're not negotiating contracts with me. They basically say to each player on the team, like, this is your sole job. Like, go ahead and go market this stuff. And at that point, you're not looking at it so much from a what's your ROI, in the sense that, like, what is the, how much money am I bringing in through dollars versus how much am I expending? You're saying, okay, this is a marketing, tool for my overall product. And that's one way that certain teams have kind of gone. I think you've seen, 100 Thieves certainly try to do that with their drink, and you've seen other teams do that as well, because you're not just looking at the team at that point, you're looking at other ways to kind of monetize. And then you have to look at it from, and so I would say that is a very, that might yield success in the future. But I do think that, really the question is on structural change from the esports ecosystem. That's one way to look at it. But then we probably also want to fix the actual problem of not having diverse revenue streams. So I could talk about that in a bit too. In terms of the expenditure point of view, I mean, listen, you saw players getting paid $6 million a year, right? Like, the best way to measure a team's finances, although you don't know the dollar value of the finances, just look at how many people they're promoting on Twitter, right? Like, you could see right there, who's on their banner, right? Like, how many sponsors they have. They put it on their website, right? So has that number gone up or has that number gone down? And that should tell you all you need to know about sponsorships. And so given that, I would say, and given the fact, by the way, that sponsorships, by my estimation, on an aggregate basis, represent roughly 70 to 80% of a team's revenues, right? Like, it's not diversified enough. If sponsorships are going down, expenditures on players, which is the primary source of expenditure or expense, that has gone down to some extent, but it's not gone down to the extent necessary to actually become, sustainable. And so you're asking how healthy the esports ecosystem is. By my estimation, I've seen anywhere from teams paying in excess of 200% of what their annualized revenues are. And I've seen higher than that, right? Like, and so the question is, how does a team sustain itself when it makes, let's just very round numbers, let's make $100 a year, right? Now it's paying $300 a year, or paying $250 a year for players. Like how could you do that, right? Because how does that make sense? The only way it makes sense for your listeners is you raise money to fund the venture, right? In which case you're giving away equity. And we could talk about that in a sec. Or you're raising debt. You're taking debt and, you're accruing debt. Either way, it's not sustainable because there needs to be a return on that investment at some point in the future to be able to pay for this thing, unless the person that's buying it is just going to put his own money in, and then the value is going to appreciate by virtue of some sort of like scarcity mechanism, where you look at what happens like the NHL, the MLB, where these franchises keep getting sold to billionaires for, excessive amounts. So you kind of just play with it for a little bit and then sell it. But we're not at that point in esports. So really, there needs to be some sort of an ROI. And what's happening is these teams basically spend more than they make. And the result is, you see what the result is. You see a bubble that is popping.
And I think that's in turn the issue which you were talking about, actually, in terms of whilst investment into an esports organization is seen as like a good thing, and it is a good thing, it all depends on the promises that those investors kind of are given and whether they can make that return on investment. And I think it was this kind of, for a lot of companies, and I think for a lot of investors, a gamble on, in the next 5 years, is esports going to be even bigger? And I don't think those promises necessarily were made. And we are starting to see that a little bit with, I think one example is teams kind of moving away from esports and going into more content creation. Is Misfits was an organization that sold its LEC slot. And there are rumors of other sales for its esports kind of operations, and they announced like a $40 million creator fund. So they've clearly identified the creator ecosystem as kind of one of their ways that they think that they can make revenue.
And unfortunately, I can't talk about Misfits because they're a client of mine. So it's very difficult for me to use specific examples. Obviously, I've worked a lot with Misfits' creators, and in particular, Ben over there is actually one of my favorite people in the industry. So, I agree with you. I think that more generally, there is a trend towards moving towards creators. And, that kind of goes back to my first point. Like, what is the future of esports? The future of esports is either diversified revenue streams to make this thing sustainable, right? It's a marketing venture for a different product, which is kind of one route we're seeing, or it's creator-owned vanity projects, right? And that is another route that we might go if, someone like a Mr. Beast wants to get involved or something like that, right? Like, they don't necessarily need to make, the money back because they have enough that it's not terribly, it's not terribly important. And then over time, as these people get older, you have to remember, like, you look at, like, the owner of the New York Mets, Steve Cohen, or John Ledecky with the New York Islanders, right? Like, these guys are like in their 60s, their 70s. They grew up being fans of the sport that they are, now invested in. There's a certain vanity associated with that, and they have enough money that it doesn't really matter. And then there's only so many teams that are available in a league that they could go ahead and sell it. And it's like, oh my God, like, now I get to play fantasy hockey or fantasy football or fantasy baseball with my rich billionaire friends, right? Like, that's kind of what it is. We don't have that in esports yet because it's just too new. So I think at some point we might, and I think that to judge the success of the industry based off of, where we are in 2023 is not really totally fair. But I think that given the fact that we don't have, this vanity project, and given the fact that we haven't really seen enough teams kind of move towards looking at this as a marketing expenditure for a larger product, though we might in the future, I would say that there needs to be some sort of diversified revenue stream, which is kind of what Misfits is doing. It's not really diversifying, not necessarily diversification of its revenue stream in the sense that, like, they still are looking at sponsors, but it's a diversification of their assets, as well as I think that there will need to be ultimately a diversification of the revenue stream, however we get there and whatever that looks like.
Do you think as well that there's kind of this sense of like not reduction, like consolidation within the esports ecosystem? There was a lot, especially now that we're going into more of a professional kind of ecosystem, where it used to be where you could kind of just create a team of 5 players and that would eventually be an esports organization. I mean, you look like TSM, for example, and many others who started off as just a group of friends and then created a company. Now it's becoming a lot more of like a professional ecosystem, but there's still a lot of those teams around there trying to still kind of get into that. Do you think that there is too many teams in the ecosystem. I know that there was a post by, I think it was Riot Games, I think it was either the CEO or the co-owner, where he talked about like the amount of teams in the League of Legends ecosystem and stuff like that. And I think that was really fascinating in itself. And actually a question that I didn't think of is that you actually look at, like, for example, football. There are 4 professional leagues officially in football, which is like 100 teams.
You have the XFL. You're talking about. Wait a second. You're talking about your football.
About soccer. Apologies. Yeah. No,
that's fine. No, I mean, obviously, if the question is like, has it grown, or has there's been the professionalization, like in soccer, what you have is the Premier League, La Liga, Bundesliga, right? Like you've got all these different leagues. In Riot, I think there's been a more of a consolidation. Like you look at the current state of the LCS, and it's CLG selling to NRG, and NRG has holdings in other esports as well, and it has other things that it does, right? So yeah, I would say that I think that is probably the way that we're going to be going for the foreseeable future. I think that there's just too many teams right now trying to sell the same thing to the same people. There's only so many sponsors interested in being in the space, and that results in a dilution of the kind of good that you're trying to sell and a reduction in the price. If there's only 5 teams that are available for a keyboard sponsorship, hypothetically, then you want to be associated with one of those 5 teams, you'll probably pay more for it. So that's just basic economic supply and demand, right?
And I think as well, it's really interesting as well, because like you've got esports is very different from like a traditional sport in general, in that you can have essentially a G2 be in 5 different titles, which is essentially like if Barcelona went into like basketball, soccer, NFL, which they do in cases.
Yeah, they actually do. Manchester City, I think they have the same ownership, or they have a split ownership group. I think they play the Yankees they are affiliated with at this point. I can't remember, but they're certainly, like, you look at Josh Harris, right? Josh Harris is the owner of the Philadelphia 76ers. He's the owner of Dignitas. He's the owner of I think he just bought the Washington Commanders, Commandeer. I think that's the name, Commanders rather. What else? Sixers. I think he also owns the Devils. So yeah, so like there's plenty of ownership groups that kind of have different holdings. Now they don't necessarily have the same brand name, but I'm not sure that that's entirely too important, to be honest with you.
Mm-hmm. So going on to kind of like the ecosystem a little bit more from like I said, I really want to delve into the team perspective. Like, how much power do you think esports organizations have now within the current esports ecosystem? We're talking about with partner programs now, with franchising. While that does provide security for some of those teams, does it also kind of limit the power that those teams have, or potentially limit the power that teams outside of that have within the esports ecosystem?
Yeah, I mean, so I'm going to talk about teams that are in the esports ecosystem. I think that's really the only useful conversation. I think that when assessing power, you should look at kind of what makes you powerful, right? And so what makes a team powerful is their ability to pay. What's their asset? The thing that they have is their players, right? But if I'm being completely honest with you, I look at the power dynamic between teams and players, and I look at a history of players essentially walking all over the teams. I think that's kind of how it's been as long as I've been in the industry, which is at least the last 8 years. And I know that's going to be a shock to some of your listeners, because we hear all the time about the poor disadvantaged players, but the reality is the players. If you look at, we just highlight League of Legends, right? League of Legends is a game where players on average were making $500,000 a year, right? They're getting paid a housing stipend. They're getting paid full benefits. There's a max contract term that they could actually, you can't pay them for you can't sign them for more than 3 years. There's a minimum player salary of $75,000. Like, just to be clear, that is in line with some traditional sports leagues, right? In America, like the MLS, not quite the NHL because the minimum salary is a little bit higher, but like a couple of years ago it would have been. And I'll tell you, the viewership numbers for the NALCS are absolutely nowhere even close. They're not in the same world as these numbers. So when I assess power, I ask, like, why is it the case that those regulations have been imposed? Why is it the case that teams need to abide by those terms? Not to say that players don't deserve, a healthy salary and that they should turn away the amount of money that they're making. But like when you look at, an LCS match bringing in 70K viewers, on Thursday night, like it's not good enough. Like, how is a team, it kind of goes back to what I was talking about before. Like, how does the team monetize? How does it make money? 70 to 80% of a team's revenues, 70 to 80% of a team's revenues is from sponsorships. That means eyes on the product. A sponsor doesn't care about who you are, how good you are at League of Legends. You're not entitled to anything by virtue of being good at a video game, or I would have been I would have made a ton of money when I was 5 years old, I promise you. Right? Like, no, like you make money because there's eyeballs and you're promoting a product. That's how sponsorships work. And there just isn't the eyeballs there to justify those numbers. The teams don't make that money to be able to justify it. So that being the case, like, what has traditionally been happening, and I think this might be a good segue into what we're talking about now, is like you look at what's happening with the NACL right now and the Challenger League, right? And what is the LCSPA's response to kind of what is happening? The response is, let's complain a lot. You see, Phil, who's we've worked together, we have a relationship there. But like, what's the response? The response is we need to lobby Riot for changes to this, to not go ahead and do this, to go back on their word, what they announced, right? When you look at Hal Biegas, who is Phil's predecessor at the NALCSPA, he gave an interview with Monte Cristo in 2019 or so, and what does he say? Maybe 2020. I can't remember the exact date, but he basically comes out and he says, we have a choice between being a union and a trade association. We choose to be a trade association because the best way for us to exert power right now is from lobbying Riot, right? So basically right now what you have is, from a legal perspective, you have Riot, who controls everything, the teams who play in Riot's league, who have no control, except over the players that they employ. And when Riot, who is the one that's making all the decisions as to what's going to go on in that league, when they're making those decisions, they have a question. Who do we appease? The owners or the players? And then so what you look at after that is, well, okay, what does Riot really care about? Riot, cares about its fan base. It cares about its popularity to some extent, right? Like, okay, well, who's more popular? The teams or the players? Who has more pull within the community? Who do people really care about? I'll tell you, when I was at H2K and we let one of our players go, Forgiven, in the summer split, the viewership of our games, we lost almost every single Greek fan that we had. And it's not because, we did anything other than release the Greek player. And so what I'll tell you is most people are fans of esports because they care about the players, not necessarily the brand. And so the players are able to exert their power through the public eye. That's kind of what they do. They have a very large microphone and people listen to them, and the teams don't really have that. And so when we're both trying to lobby the same party for, favorable rules, what has historically been the case is the players have won out on that. And you see that in the sense of, well, they have all of these benefits. They have, like I said, they have healthcare benefits. They have vision benefits. They have housing that they get provided to them. They have minimum contracts. They have max deals. They have, excessive payments. And there's a whole host of other things to it. And that's simply because what they did was they went to Riot and said, make this part of your rule set, and Riot did. And so now all those restrictions or all those requirements have been passed through. Riot says, hey team, if you want to play in our league, you have to follow those rules. And that's kind of where we are.
Just to clarify for people who aren't aware exactly of what the ruling is, just to believe if I'm correct on this one as well, it is the LCS teams basically voting that they don't want to have a challenger team, right?
Well, let's be clear on the voting, right? Like, Riot ultimately controls what happens, right? Riot makes the decision.
Yes.
Okay.
So but it's the LCS teams essentially, trying to go for no challenger teams, not for this season, but it'd be for potentially. If it would.
I think it's 2023 summer. No, I think it's actually 23 summer. Is what I think that's what I could be wrong about that, but let me see. Summer.
Which is essentially them getting rid of academy teams, which if LEC, I believe that is also not a mandatory, that is a voluntary option now in the LEC as well, which I think that came into account last year, was the belief of that. I just wanted to clarify that was the the situation, which is why the players are now going against that. I know.
I think the LCSPA put out a statement basically saying that I think they were talking about the NACL 2023 summer. So I think that's kind of what we're talking about. But I think that what I'll say is it comes back to the economics again, right? And this is kind of where you and I were having this conversation, like, well, what is the actual benefit of having, and this is maybe too robotic of me, but like, you have to remember, just because you're good at a video game doesn't entitle you to anything, right? At least it's like, I could be the best, handball player in the world, but if there's no audience for that, then, what's the viewership of the NACL? And how much are these people getting paid? Is it worth the investment? And that's ultimately a decision for the people that are paying the money to invest in them, right? And that's kind of where we have right now. And so, I think the question you had asked was about power. Like, what I would say is, up until this point, it has historically been the case that power lies in Riot, and then after that, the players are kind of able to impose their will, so to speak, by virtue of of lobbying Riot. And there's always kind of been this, I think there's been this unfair notion that teams are mistreating players, and it's true in some cases. There's definitely been a whole host of them, but and I wouldn't say there haven't been. There certainly have been, and it's certainly much better than it was when I got into the scene in 2015. But no, I would say that if anyone is making 500 average in the LCS, like 500K, like, it's a pretty nice life, to be honest with you. It's not the worst thing. We could live much worse.
Well, in terms of like utilizing these players as well, I think one thing that I think I'm starting to see a lot more is a lot more like streaming, and whether that be the players themselves streaming. I believe ESG.
Yes, but remember who owns those contracts. When the player streams, they're not streaming on the team's channel. They're streaming on their own channel. The donations are going to the players.
Which specifically do that though, like, which will have like you stream a certain amount of contracts.
Every player in basically every league at this point is on our standard form contract, right? And so the answer is going to be yes. We do impose minimum stream requirements, but you have to remember that how does the team actually monetize through the player's stream? The only way it really monetizes through the player's stream is if they're showing the team sponsors on the player's stream. But all the direct revenue that you would otherwise see from a player's stream, which is something like, subscriptions, donations, even ad incentives that they might have with Twitch, like, all that stuff is going directly to the player. The teams don't touch that. So, streaming is nice, but it's unless you're streaming on the team's channel, which some teams have actually required, and I think that is the intelligent thing to do. That would never fly with half of these players. Like, that is how it works in professional sports, for what it's worth. Like, I would say that is probably the way that it should go.
So to move on a little bit about kind of teams, one thing I'm really interested actually about is the decision to go into franchising, and this kind of maybe decision to not do franchising, what is kind of coming out in terms of partner team programs. How involved was ESG in kind of the involvement of when franchising was starting to happen, especially within Riot Games?
I think so. How involved were we? We basically represented every single team that was maybe 7 of the 10 teams in the LCS, and then I think it was 6 of the 10 teams at the time in the LEC. So that meant that what happens is Riot Games comes out with a team participation agreement, and they say, here's the rules for the league that you're going to be agreed to be bound by, and we had to review that for a whole host of teams. And the benefit is that we kind of know the terms that are being offered to each team, and there's MFNs, so it's basically the same thing. With that said, like, we're able to kind of, when we talk to Riot, when I say something to Riot, it carries a different weight as if someone that was only representing one team was saying to Riot, because they know that I have reviewed this with each of my teams, and if we're doing a review of it, they could assume, like, okay, like, he's not just speaking for Team X, he's speaking for Team X through whatever, like however many teams. So it gave us a certain amount of power in those negotiations. And allowed us to make a bunch of things a little bit more favorable for us with respect to franchising. But before we move on to franchising, I do want to talk one last thing about, we were talking about the NACL, and I think it's important to kind of discuss one other topic on this. That's the topic of unionization. It's something that I wrote an article about in 2019 on the Esports Bar Association. So just so you guys know, the viewers, I'm or I was at one point the executive director. I'm now co-executive director now of the Esports Bar Association. I'm also on the board of directors and one of its founding members. It's a nonprofit. We don't take any money from it. It's just something we do out of the goodness of trying to make the standards in esports a little bit better. So we don't draw salary. We kind of just have a whole bunch of members that are interested in talking about legal regulations in the esports industry. And one of the things I wrote about was a publication in 2019 about unionization, and I talked at the time about how actually I don't think it would be advantageous for the players to unionize. And the reason I bring this up right now, Tom, is because we were talking about the power dynamic, and I think that it's worth noting that if players felt so disadvantaged, they have the option to go ahead and seek unionization. They could collectively choose to unionize in the LCS, right? They could be an LCS Players Association, which functions right now as a trade association. They could choose to function as a union. They do not do that, and it is intentional. The reason they do not do that is because if you look at professional sports, the NBA, the NHL, the NFL, even to some extent in over on your side of the pond, they have financial fair play in UEFA, right? And so we have these things called salary caps that are basically devices used by a league to cap the expenditure of a team. And the reason why you do this is because if you consider the fact that for a large portion of your revenue is based on sponsorships, or it's based on broadcasting rights, which is ultimately a metric of viewership, the teams that are the best teams in the league are the ones that get the most viewers. And so you're always going to be trying to climb to the top of the hill to seek that same pot of money from the viewership. So the result is there's an inflated price, right? And you in order to stay relevant, particularly in soccer, you need to avoid relegation. So you pour money into a thing, right? And that's kind of what you do, because if you don't pour money into it, you get relegated, you lose all your viewership, your business goes to shit, right? So I guess the point what I'm trying to make here is that it had been the case in the NHL, in soccer. Look at soccer. Pre-2010 financial fair play, a lot of these teams were spending in excess of 100% of their revenues. In the NHL, in 2003, prior to the imposition of a salary cap, a lot of these teams were spending, I think the New York Times said it was on average 77% of their team revenue, right? It's not a situation too dissimilar from the one that we see in esports right now, right? Well, obviously the revenues there are a little bit more diversified. You have ticket sales, you have merchandise sales, which is more successful. Sponsorships don't make up such a big portion of it, but the point is, remember though, but what is media rights? Like, media rights is a media company paying you money to exclusively broadcast your thing on that channel. And the reason they do that is because they think they're going to receive advertising revenue because there's going to be a lot of viewers so it's really the similar thing, right? Like, so it still kind of comes back to advertising. So it's based on viewership. So you had all these teams just outspending and trying to spend so much money, and it results in them paying excessive amounts, which they might not necessarily, be able to afford, or they might not. It's just not smart business. It devalues the asset, and so 77% in the NHL in 2003. They basically have a lockout in 2004, 2005, where the Players Association is as a union is seeking to collectively bargain with the NHL, and the NHL says, we're not going to have a league unless you agree to a salary cap. And the Players Association says, we're not agreeing to a salary cap. No way. And the NHL says, okay, we're not going to have a league. Enjoy not getting paid for a year. Right. And that's literally what happened. They didn't get paid for an entire year. And then next year they come back to the table and say, okay, we'll do a salary cap. Right. And then they put a salary cap on. Guess what the players make today in the NHL? They make 50% of the team revenue. So if a team makes $100 in a year, $50 of that is being spread out amongst all the players. And that is a much more sustainable business. The same thing in the NBA. The NBA had this problem in 1983. And then eventually they put on a salary cap. Now revenue's capped at 56% of what the players make. It had been upwards of 60, high above 60, right? So, and there was actually people who were saying, yeah, go ahead and strike. We don't really care. We don't want to pay you anyway because it's just not a sustainable venture. So I guess the point I'm making is players in the NALCSPA, right? Like, they fully understand. I'm sorry about that. My dog is going crazy, by the way. But they fully understand that if they wanted to, they could go ahead and unionize tomorrow. And if they were to unionize, they could actually collectively bargain with these teams for more favorable rights for them. Like they could basically say, hey, like we're going to require you to field a team. We're going to require you to field an ACL team. As a condition of your being in the league in this collective bargaining agreement, you are required to field an NACL team. They don't do that. Why don't they do that? Why do they choose to only pursue a lobbying campaign against Riot? The reason is because if they unionized, they would be opening themselves up to collective bargaining negotiations where they lose the protections of the Sherman Antitrust Act. And if they lose the protections of the Sherman Antitrust Act, we can impose a salary cap on them through negotiation.
And to be fair,
if they don't do that, we can't. We cannot impose a salary cap on them unless they unionize. They won't do that.
To be fair as well is that what as well from a player perspective, what does the player get as well? Because the player already gets like the housing done. They already get through a lot of these contracts. They already get everything that you would typically want anyway. So why would a player? Unless it is for, like you said, the complete collapse of an ecosystem, essentially.
Right. They could negotiate to prevent that kind of a thing, and they choose not to because up until now they have been able to accomplish their goals through a lobbying campaign on Riot, which then passes it through down to us. And it is my personal opinion, and this is not the opinion of any of the teams, but I will tell you, having studied the history of professional sports, pretty intensely, you look at like the 1960s, right? Like, there was this thing called the reserve clause in baseball. And what did that do? It basically prevented players from being free agents, right? And so a player had to stay on the team that he was with, essentially, right? And so that eventually changed when Curt Flood basically sued the MLB and they gave players restricted free agency. But this was the impetus for the creation of, across every league, players associations, player rights, is because these players were being treated so poorly. And there hadn't really been these legal frameworks in place to regulate these, abusive teams, that the players had no choice but to unionize. And so that is not the case in esports. For the most part, players have not really gone through these kinds of excessive hardships that Curt Flood had to go through, where he literally couldn't be a free agent, right? Like players in esports enjoy all the benefits of free agency. They have free agency. There is no player draft in the NHL. If you go ahead and want to join a team, you get drafted onto a team. You don't get to pick your team, and you just stay with that team for 7 years. That's not the case in esports. You can just sign on whatever team you want to sign on, right? Like you have unrestricted free agency, you have a minimum salary, and there's no cap. So it's just like, why would I unionize? And so the incentives have never really made sense for unionization, and it's kind of why when you see all these players complain on Twitter, and you see the NALCSPA complain on Twitter, you say, like, why not just unionize? They don't really have a good answer for that. Like, the answer is like, yeah, I don't know. Maybe I should. The reality is maybe they should in the future, because they certainly have the power through negotiation of a collective bargaining agreement to get to a certain point where they could get things that they want whilst giving teams the things that they want. And ultimately, this structural change, and it is my firm belief that this structural change will yield a healthier ecosystem. Because if we're able to impose a salary cap on them, yes, we will limit the capacity of their top earners to make money. That is undoubtedly true. But they will be able to protect the things that they want to protect, and we will be able to limit, our financial downside. And then the result is we're aligned now. There's alignment. We know what the terms are. We see each other's books. We can move and negotiate collectively against Riot, because we have our interests aligned at this point. It's not currently the case. We're both snipping at Riot, coming from two different angles.
Yeah, it's funny actually, because like I said, when there was the initial launch of the franchise model, when I initially saw it, I remember the pie chart they gave, and it was like it was the operator, so it was Riot, it was teams, and it was players, and it's like all equal. That was the big saying about the franchise. It's all going to be equal in terms of revenue, which is going to be given.
Well, that's Riot. That's Riot revenue, to be clear.
Exactly, yeah, through Riot revenue. But really, it's Riot, right? And then it's the other two, and then it's kind of like fighting through, because Riot is it's unlike, like I said, traditional sports. It is a private entity, like football or NFL or American football is not owned by an entity, essentially. The sport,
right? Yeah, I think the copyright in the game basically is owned by Riot, so Riot has the exclusive rights to determine the way that it is played. Whereas football, that is not the case. Anyone can make a football league if they want.
That's why you have the XFL and the NFL,
right. Exactly.
because it is essentially doing that same. So I think it's fascinating. But did you think that it was going to kind of go more of a unionization route then when franchising was initially kind of pitched? And when
no, there's just no incentive. In order for players to unionize, there needs to be incentive to unionize, and they have not felt the hardship, and they have not felt the pain that a lot of their predecessors in other sports have felt. So there's and frankly, I don't want to make, I don't think anyone should want someone to feel to have these things, right? Like to basically say like, oh yeah, like, we're going to make you guys, incentivize you to unionize. It sounds like a terrible thing. And it's really a problem with the legal system, to be honest with you, because the fact that we could only properly structure the league upon unionization with a salary cap, which is used in, a hard salary cap is used in 3 of the 4 major sports leagues in America, and a soft salary cap is used in baseball. We can't even do this stuff because we can't make use of the non-statutory labor exemption granted when you're negotiating with a union. So it's just all kind of pointless.
I do before because we're coming close to the end of the podcast.
Yeah, it went by quick. We talked a lot about.
Yeah, no, I do want to chat about the partner program because I think it's really interesting to see how esports ecosystems have transitioned from franchising, which is a fixed fee, to get into a league to now more of this partnership program. I mean, you look at the differences between what League of Legends did and Valorant have done. Valorant is now this free to enter partner program revenue share, where League of Legends obviously was very much a pay to go in. Do you think that is a kind of an indictment of like what the industry is, or do you think it's kind of like a track back from having this investment to go into a game?
I think that what you're talking about is you look at with Valorant. There were certain teams invited to the Valorant program to basically be able to participate. Whatever they want to do. Like Riot saying you get to be in this league. Don't worry about it. Right? Like they're not paying an entry fee like perhaps they might have in the Overwatch League or in the CDL or even in the LCS, right? Like, but certainly their revenue the upside is capped, right? And so there's certain types of sharing, but then the upside for sharing in the long term and across other different properties may not be, there's trade-offs, right? Like there may not be a one-to-one on everything. So that's not to say there might not be more favorable sharing on certain things, but like, I would say that, like, more generally speaking, you're not paying to get into the league, so maybe, maybe it shouldn't be. But if the question is, do I think that that's like the future model? I think that when you look at the expenditure that was paid to get into a lot of these leagues, is really handicapping for a lot of these teams, particularly in the Overwatch League and the CDL, where you're paying tens of $1 million. I mean, not to say you didn't pay $10 million to get into the LCS, right? But like you're not paying $25 million to get into a league. Like, how do you pay that? Where's the revenue come from? It's just an investment. You have payments recurring every single year. Like it's handicapping because it's just an expense. Like June comes, oh God, I got to make this payment again, right? Give me another couple $1 million, right? Like it's not there. So I think this is obviously, given the state of the ecosystem, a little bit more favorable for the teams because it relieves them kind of a burden of a burden. With that said, I'm not sure. I truthfully, I don't know that this is the way forward from an ecosystem perspective. I think if you were to ask me what the answer is from how do we move forward, I would say that viewership needs to increase just as a pure business matter, right? Which is going to mean the game has to be successful. And then I would say once viewership increases, I need to have I'm not sure that the operator, whether it's Riot Games or whomever, I'm not sure why that entity needs to exist. I think that there could be a payment made by the teams to a Riot Games or to a whomever. I mean, this is like years down the line. We're talking like decades, right? Like, but like that could be a licensing fee essentially paid, kind of like what Valve does, and then say, you run the league however you want to run it, and you monetize it however you want to monetize it. And the benefit of that would be you don't have to split the money, that you're able to come up with that third party, and you don't have to play ball with them in these negotiations. You basically get to do whatever the heck you want to do when you're running your league because you have a license to run the league. Now, there's literally no way that certain developers will ever go for that kind of thing because they're far too hands-on with their product. That's fine. I'm not sure that those ecosystems will be successful. If you're asking me what are the most successful ecosystems generally, I would say that it is my experience that the most successful ecosystems, the ones with the most longevity, that have the least expenditure and the highest upside, those are the ones that don't actually have the developer intervention. Like, look at Super Smash Brothers, right? And by the way, I look at a guy like Cody Schwab, who is a New York guy just like me. He is probably the best Melee player in the world right now. I don't know how much you watch Melee, but he's at least top 3, right? But he's probably the best in the world, in my opinion. I watch all the time. And this guy doesn't even have a team right now. Like, he literally does not have an esports team to play for because CLG's gone, and he was with Panda before that, right? Like, even when he's there, he streams literally every single day. He does MetaFi lessons every single day. Like, this guy is going across the country every single week to be able to compete so he can make the money to do what he loves to do. This guy doesn't have a team, but he's not entitled. Like, he doesn't view that he's like entitled to it, and he doesn't like whine about it. But yeah, when a Melee competition goes live and it's a major, they're drawing 60K minimum viewership. Like, why is this guy not permitted? Like, why is he not entitled to get a team? What is the difference between him and an ACL player? Why are they more entitled to that kind of a thing, right? Like, this guy, the Melee scene is just so resilient, and they are so, they're so impressive because they have no support whatsoever, and they continue to push on. And if there was ever a scene that deserved it, is Melee. They get, they've gone through a lot. And other than that, I would say you look at World of Warcraft. And, we started this interview with World of Warcraft. Might as well finish it, right? World of Warcraft does not have developer intervention either in certain respects. Like, you look at the Race to the World First. This is an event that just ran for the past week between 3 competitor teams, Method. Well, really anyone could get involved if they want to, but there are 3 main teams, Method, Echo, and Liquid, right? These teams are putting up content on their Twitch 24/7. On their Twitch, their owned and operated Twitch. So they're generating the revenue from that. They pay their teams, but they're paying their teams, they're not killing themselves in terms of how much they're paying them. And then on top of that, they're generating, at any given time, 50K concurrent on Liquid and Echo, and closer to 15K concurrent on across Methods properties, right? Like, it's a good bet. They do more hours than the LCS does over the course of 2 months.
And you talk about kind of like commercial and partnerships. Like, I know that Echo, every time that there's a Race the World First, they have like a slate of, here's 10 partners who are now partnering for Race the World First. And you go on their Twitch stream, which is going, I think Team Liquid did it was first, they were first in 7 days, weren't it? Something like that, streaming. Yeah, and it's like all of Echo's stream will have all their partners constantly on their Twitch, and then they'll have like a short-term deal, go away, and then next Race the World First, they'll announce a new slate of partners.
But you know what? Where's Blizzard in that? Blizzard's not, and you know how long the Race to the World First has been going on? Since 2004. It's been going on since 2004. Blizzard has never even stuck a hand into it. They don't do anything, right? But yet the ones with the longevity, Melee, how long has Melee been going on? 2001, right? Like, over 20 years. Like, these are the games with longevity because, for whatever reason, you have these communities which spawn, which really love, these games. And they say, we're going to build something special amongst ourselves. And that's how these things are ultimately successful and affordable. You don't have these massive investments coming in to kind of skew the marketplace, so to speak. And so when you ask me what is the future, I think the future is in franchise leagues like we have right now. I hope that we will eventually see some form of collective bargaining with a salary cap and more sustainable revenue structures through a diversification of the revenue. Maybe that's microtransactions. And then I hope, to be honest with you, that really esports will find its passion at the grassroots level again, because I think that is, so many successful games. It's not to say you have to do one or the other, but so many successful games have made use of that grassroots passion, and I hope that we can kind of get back to that.
Well, it's about utilizing what is still a very passionate fan base, like the audience. Like, I think there's this main thing between like the from a financial standpoint, esports is a lot lower, but from actually an audience standpoint, from still passion, that audience is still there, and it's still keeping that audience engaged. And grassroots does that, creating stuff like that. You want to make sure that you keep that pathway while also, trying to build a better structure at the top as well, right?
Absolutely. You can't get rid of the grassroots. How did baseball start? How did hockey start, right? Like, these leagues were just, club leagues where you would basically say like, oh, I want to have like a small competition with, the local guys, right? Like, and that's really, if you look at some of the people that were playing like baseball in the 1880s, which is when the league started, by the way. So when you ask me how far along are we from, being successful, you consider the fact that baseball literally started over 140 years ago. Like, no, like they weren't the most in shape guys. They probably couldn't hit a curveball. They probably didn't even know what a curveball was. They actually used to play baseball with silverware. You know why home plate is called home plate? It's because they couldn't actually afford a piece of rubber to put as the plate. They literally put a piece of silverware at home plate. That's a true story. So, we're a long ways, we're farther along than they were, but, we've got a long ways to go, and I hope we get there.
Harris, it's been an absolute pleasure chatting to you. I believe we could have gone for a little bit longer, to be honest. But is there any final words that you have to say, whether it's about like the topic that we have or about ESG law in general?
I mean, I know that you were so kind to talk to me, and I really appreciate everything you do over here. I hope your listeners know that they've got one of the good ones, and thank you for having me. We talked a lot about me and my take on this, but I wouldn't be where I am without. Or ESG wouldn't be where it is without, all of our partners at the firm and our associates. I just want to say it's such a pleasure being able to work with them every single day too. Bryce, Krista, Lydia, AJ, and Yen are a fantastic team. Jeannie too. It's a fantastic team we have over there, and really being able to kind of navigate these waters in these times with such a great team really, I think, makes us special. That's what makes ESG. That's what puts the magic in the sauce. It's the secret sauce.
Amazing, thank you. And if you do want to follow Harris, follow him on LinkedIn. I'm guessing he'll love the requests and all the conversation that will probably go through that. And same with Twitter, ESG, follow them as well. We'll put the Twitter banner on the actual podcast. We'll make the podcast look a little bit nicer and have the Twitter handle up and everything. And if you do want to watch any of the previous episodes that we have done, we've done one with Blast, we've done one with WePlay, trying to name not a tournament organizer. At Twitter, we did one with Twitter, was like one of our first ones. So that was an interesting one. But yeah, thank you, Harris, for taking the time to speak to me. And thank you, everybody, for listening to this as well. And we'll see you next time.